Hello, I'm Derek with the North Little Rock Public Library System and want to welcome you to Meet the Author. Joining us today is Jen Fawkes, author of Tales the Devil Told Me, a collection of 12 stories reimagining the lives of classic literary villains. Tales the Devil Told Me was awarded the 2021 Forward Indies Silver Medal and is a finalist for the 2022 World Fantasy Award for Best Collection. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you for being here.
It's my pleasure, Derek. Thank you for having me.
I'm just curious, as I read that introduction, when will you find out if you've won the award?
I actually will. I have a 1-year teaching job at LSU this year, so I'm in Baton Rouge, Louisiana right now.
Yes.
And the World Fantasy Convention is taking place conveniently in New Orleans, an hour from where I am. So I'll be traveling to New Orleans from Baton Rouge on November the 3rd, I believe.
Okay.
And there's a weekend-long World Fantasy Convention that I will be attending. I'm going to, go to panels, and I'm doing a reading from the book at the convention. And then on Sunday, there will be an awards ceremony. And at that ceremony, I will find out whether or not I won the award.
Okay. Well, best wishes on that. So I'm sure that you're excited. So, if this is any indication, then by all means, because I was just entranced by it. But let me ask you before, I've got a lot of questions I want to ask, and I'll try to be as fast as I can.
Okay.
Where did you get the cover for the book? I think it's ingenious the way they did this.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, the cover was a collaborative. So it was a collaboration. A woman who is now the fiction editor at Press 53, which is the press in North Carolina that published the book. The book won they have an annual contest, a short story collection contest, and the winner, the prize is publication and then like a monetary prize. So this book was the 2020 winner of that award. And the woman who was the fiction editor there at the time, she's come up with a lot of their book covers. And so she came up with a cover that I was not really feeling. And I said, I kind of thought about something that used like almost some sort of like, I was looking for something sort of comic related or that sort of caricatured in a way, at least one of the characters from one of the stories. So we talked back and forth, and she found this queen image and she showed that to me. And then we went back and forth about like the background, the color. I put the smoke in. We came up with, so it was a collaborative effort between a woman named Claire Fawkes, but her last name is spelled Foxx, who is the fiction editor at Press 53 which is in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and then me. So we kind of collaborated and came up with this. And I love the cover as well. So I'm glad you like it.
Yeah. Well, it reminds me a little bit of the movie The Manchurian Candidate with Lawrence Harvey and Angela Lansbury, who died just recently.
She's one of my all-time favorite actresses. I am very much a classic film. I actually, when I was getting my PhD, I wrote a paper on The Manchurian Candidate, a long critical paper for a film class on The Manchurian Candidate and North by Northwest. I am like a classic film maniac. So anyway, if you want to talk about movies, we can talk about that too.
Okay.
But the Queen of Hearts. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Well, let me go ahead and get started talking about your book and about you. Who inspired you to write?
Well, my first inspiration, I would say, was my mother. My mother was, I grew up in Little Rock. Well, I wasn't born in Little Rock. I was born in Chicago, lived in California, and I was very small. But my mom is from a small town down on the Delta in southeast Arkansas, in Arkansas County. So when my parents split up, she moved my sister and I and herself back to Arkansas. So that was when I was in elementary school, and we moved around a bit, but I ended up finishing high school in Little Rock, and then I went to Central, and then I went off to undergrad. I went to Manhattan. I went to New York City for college, and I was away for many years. So I'm a little rocker. My mom was my main inspiration because she was a literature maniac. She read like a fiend. It was her whole world, and she wanted to be a writer. It was her big dream to be a writer. So from a very young age, she encouraged me to also write and to do really all kinds of artistic pursuits. She was very into the arts. But she when I was I have a very vivid images of her both reading all the time when I was a child and staying up very late, typing on a typewriter, typing stories and novels and things. She published some stories when I was a child. She wrote a couple novels that she was never able to get published. So she was my first and main inspiration. She also gave me books because she read voraciously, I read voraciously, and she gave me all sorts of adult reading matter when I was really far too young, but that's okay. I learned a lot. Sort of a crash course in being a human being. But yeah, so my mom was my first and most influential influence in terms of pushing me toward writing and literature.
Okay.
For sure.
Who are your favorite authors and especially maybe any that influenced your writing style?
Yeah, well, I am someone who believes everything that I've read, everything that I've watched, like if you make art, you're taking in texts, you're taking in images throughout your life. Those things work, your internal processes work on them and then they come back out. I'm someone who believes very much in acknowledging influence and acknowledging the artifice of the things that we make. I think that it's I'm much more into work that says, "Hey, I'm made," than work that's like I'm reality that purports to be reality. So okay. I like work that sort of points to its own artificiality in the fact that it's art. But let's say, voracious reader when I was growing up. So like when I was a kid, I read all of Stephen King's books. Oh, okay. When I was a small child, I read all of Kurt Vonnegut's work when I was a child. I read things like I read Hunter S. Thompson. I read wildly inappropriate reading material. But then I also read, because I was just sort of a reading machine, I read like Sweet Valley High books. And I read V.C. Andrews was a huge, I loved those books when I was a child. So I just pretty much read anything and everything I could get my hands on. My all-time favorite book growing up was probably it's a toss-up between Watership Down by Richard Adams, which remains one of the most important books for me. And the book Italo Calvino's Italian Folk Tales, which is like a 12 or 1500 page book of collected Italian folk tales that I dragged around when I was a child and read cover to cover multiple times. So okay. I read a lot. I read a whole lot. And
it sounds like
those,
it, yes.
Yeah, all of those people influenced me. Absolutely. Some of them directly, some of them in ways I'm conscious of, and all of them in ways I'm unconscious of.
Okay. I asked that question because I think it was Henry James had influenced Edith Wharton.
Yes.
And criticism of her was she sounded just too much like him and she had to defend herself. And so I thought, well, maybe you had that kind of influence, but you don't tend to imply that even though they might have influenced you, you don't write. No one would say, "Hey, she's just a copycat." Yes. I
don't believe so. Yeah, because my work is one of the reasons that it's hard to sell is because it is really unusual. Okay. It is pretty unique work. There's not really a lot of people who are mining the exact same veins that I am mining. And so for some people it's too much or challenging or whatnot. But I mean, it's not, I would not say it's really derivative, although it is heavily influenced by everything I've ever encountered. Mm-hmm. It's not derivative though, I would say, in my opinion.
Okay. Now, did anyone ever give you any advice when you began to write your writing career, professionally, whether it was another a publisher or another writer, something like that? Because as you said, your mother, and I was listening carefully, but I think you said your mother didn't really get anything published. And there are a lot of people that they want to get published. They don't get published. But did anyone give you any advice?
Well, publishing. Well, like I've gotten a lot of writing advice. Publishing advice is harder to come by. People are because publishing is such a closed industry. It's very, very difficult to break into. And with each passing day, the publishing world is shrinking and shrinking and shrinking, right? The big five, well, they're about to be four. There used to be 30 years ago, there were 30 publishing houses in New York. Today, there are 5. Wow. So publishing has been shrinking rapidly since the beginning of this century, and even before, starting in the 90s. The chances, and there are even more people writing now than there were then. So the chances of getting somewhere are slim. And that's something that's hard. It's hard for me, someone who's devoted my life to writing, to accept. But I've got lots of great, but I would say publication advice, no. I have an MFA in creative writing. So I have a master's in creative writing, and then I also have a PhD. It's a hybrid PhD in English literature and creative writing. So I have studied writing for years and years and years, and even in those contexts, there was never any discussion of publication or of how you get your work out there. Nowadays, those kinds of programs are telling young writers more about how to get their work out there. But when I was in them, it was very much like, we're here to make art. We're not here to talk about business. So that was why talking about publishing in any way was verboten. Like, especially when I did my master's degree, we were not allowed to talk about it. We were there strictly to develop our craft, to work on our craft and develop our skills and become artists. So it was, even though I was someone who wanted that kind of advice, people weren't giving it to me. I mean, when I had my 2 books, I had a book published in 2020 and 2021. They were both finished for 10 years, or at least this book was written when I was doing my MFA. So it was written between 2010 and 2008 and 2010. And then it was published in 2021. And it didn't really change in those years. I had it sitting on the shelf because I was waiting to write a novel that would get me a top agent, that would get me a book deal. And none of that ever happened. So then, I finally was like, well, let me submit my 2 story collections to small presses and contests. And that's what I did. And then they both were published in 2020 and 2021. So.
Okay. Well, I asked that sort of question because a lot of people that watch this program are authors or potential authors, and any way that we can help them to get published, and many of them are self-published. They do it through companies like Amazon. That's the only way they can get it done. So for someone who's had 2 books, it demonstrates that even people who've had it done, it is a challenge. So I wish you the very best. Do you have anything else? Is something in the works right now? A 3rd book?
Oh, well, I have a novel that's finished. That is, I got it. I don't know how much. So I have a novel. I started working on it many years ago. I put it aside for a couple of years while I finished my PhD and dealt with other life stuff. Then I pulled it out and completely revamped it and rewrote the book. Really did a complete overhaul during the pandemic times, like during 2020 and into 2021. And that book is, I signed with an agent who loved the book, and then she was a former editor, and she has ended up going back to editing. So I'm kind of back at square one with that book. So it's a book that I really believe in, and I'm submitting it now to smaller presses and contests and things like that, like I did with my first 2 books. Mm-hmm. And it is it's a novel. It's a novel that's it's a novel in 3 parts. One of which is a lost play of Aristophanes. So I got to write like a lost comedy, a lost Greek comedy for the book, which is the kind of thing I like to do. But then I'm working on two other novels right now. So I'm always working on something.
Okay. Well, best wishes on that. Yes.
Oh, thank you.
What do your friends, your family, your colleagues think of this book?
Oh, well, they love it.
Uh-huh. I mean, I assumed an answer, but I always like to give the author the opportunity just to say, give an answer like that. Yeah, okay.
They love it, or so they tell me. No, I
Okay.
mean,
Okay.
no. Everybody in my life, everybody that is, that I know and love. Well, I mean, I do have some family that are, I'm like, I don't know how this is going to hit you because they're like, my work might, it veers into sort of definitely not PG territory in a lot of instances. I mean, this book is. I mean, this book is the way this book kind of walks a line because it's using it's using stories that we all know and love in a lot of instances. So that can kind of allow you, but I like to take the familiar and put it together with the unfamiliar. So like to show people the things they already know from a new angle or with fresh eyes. That's kind of one of my overarching projects as a writer. So, I have some family members who might be a little like taken aback by some of the events, right? Because there's a good bit of violence. I mean, things happen. They're not necessarily, PG, as I said, but mostly, I don't have. Most of the people that I know and love are pretty open-minded, artistic type folks, and they, as far as I know, they love my.
Yeah. I'm sure one of the best compliments you'll ever get is if you get an email or a letter from a student or a faculty member who says, hey, I had to read your story in a class of mine, or I used it for a paper of mine, or I'm going to assign my class to read this story. That would be, to me, the ultimate. Oh, yeah. So I wish you the very best if you haven't had that compliment already. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I've had over the years, I've had a lot of people reach out to me because I've had some really high profile short fiction publications,
Okay.
in pretty major venues. So I've had a lot of people like reach out to me over the years about my stories, and people teach my work, and I know a guy who teaches in West Virginia who's been teaching one of the stories from this book, Tiny Bones, since it was first published in like 2011 or 2012, maybe. He's been teaching it to his students every year. So, and I only found that out like last year,
Well, what a compliment. Good for you. Good for you. All right. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Now, about the book itself.
Yeah.
The short stories are based on literary characters, some of whom are quite mean. How did you decide which ones to pick?
Well, the origin story of the book, it was my MFA thesis project. And so what I decided, and this was my first year, I'm trying to remember how I came up with the idea initially. I guess I started writing the Polyphemus story, which it's called A Moment on the Lips, the story about the Cyclops from the Odyssey. It's Polyphemus is his name. And the Odyssey is a really important text to me. And I can't remember if I started writing the story first or if the idea came to me, but I decided I was going to rewrite the Odyssey in a series of short stories from the point of view of the people Odysseus encounters on his journey. So a story from the point of view of the Lotus Eaters and Circe and like that. So this was in 2008. And I told some of my classmates about my plan, or I wrote the first story, the story about Polyphemus, and I turned it into the workshop, and people were like, this is great, but a book just like that came out last year. So this guy named Zachary Mason had written a book called The Lost Books of the Odyssey that was essentially that was the book. It was like the stories from the point of view of everyone else on Odysseus's journey. But I loved the book so much, the story that I had written so much, that I wanted to try to find a different container that could hold it and other stories to be my thesis project. So I came up with the notion of taking well-known popular literary villains and retelling their stories, putting the villain at the center of the story in some way. but I wanted to do it in a variety of ways because I like variety unlike a lot of readers, I like variety in a collection. So I made a really long list of literary villains, I made a long list of villains. And during the year and a half I had left in the program, I set out to write as many of the stories as I could that recentered the stories on the villain. And they're all done in different ways. Like there's a story about Captain Hook that's told from the point of view of his stepson after he's left pirating and is working in a post office. But then there's the story of Hamlet, where I basically tell a prequel of all of the events that led up to the play Hamlet. So that story focuses on Claudius, the villain, but it starts when he's a child and he and Big Hamlet are brothers and they're children, and then they grow up and that story ends. That's the longest story in the book. It ends with the play Hamlet, the actual events of the play Hamlet. So some of them take the character the villain out of their original context and put them in a new context. Some of them leave them in their context. There's a story about Medusa dating a plastic surgeon, and she plays music in an all-girl rock band. So, it's many of them are playful. Many of them, I'm someone who loves humor and I like playful work. So that was so I set out to write it as a book, and I wrote it and I finished it in 2010. There were 2 stories that were originally in it that I ended up removing because they weren't strong enough for me. For my criteria is that they both need to stand alone as a story for a reader who doesn't know the original. It needs to be a story that is engaging enough that if the reader has never read Rebecca, that story that's told from the point of view of Mrs. Danvers, that they will enjoy that story. So I needed it to both pay homage to the original, but also stand on its own enough that someone who's not that familiar with Sherlock Holmes could still enjoy the story. Okay. So and then I just wrote the book. I've never written a book this quickly. I wrote this book really quickly, and part of it was deciding that I would do that, deciding here's my container. I'm putting these parameters around myself. Giving yourself rules that you have to follow often makes writing easier, because within a set of rules, you can sort of open yourself up and go crazy, but within a contained set of rules. So if you dance in a fence, you can dance longer than if you're dancing outside of a fence in some ways. Okay. That makes sense.
Well, I think you succeeded. Some of those, let me explain why. Some of the stories I recognized. I recognized Rebecca. I recognized Hamlet. But some of the other stories, I didn't know who they were. But as you said, it stood on its own. So I think you succeeded in making them. That if you had 12 different stories published in 12 different publications, you wouldn't have had to have read the original work to be able to read it and to enjoy it. So I think you were very successful in setting that goal, because it worked for me. So I'm glad you explained that. And so anyone who reads this book will then understand, well, I don't have to get the original to really know what's going on. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. I'm glad to hear that.
I get a kick. Dear Ahab is 2 pages. How did you get away with that? I know you could in a magazine, let's say like the New Yorker or the Journal of Southern Literature, something like that, you could probably publish something, but I just thought, this is only 2 pages. I just got a kick out of that.
Yeah, so with that, Moby Dick is one of my favorite books. It's a very important text for me. I love Melville. He's one of my favorite writers, and I thought how fantastic to not only flip the story around so that the whale is actually the one who's obsessed with Ahab, but then also make it 2 pages long. So so make it the shortest story about the longest book, right? Just a flash. But I think that there's a whole lot of if you distill Moby Dick down, if you take away all the whale chapters, like if you get rid of all the chapters about like whale anatomy and like all the details, about that, like I kind of capture like the gist of Moby Dick in that 2-page story, except flipped,
Okay.
So,
All right.
yeah.
Now, even though the stories are sometimes are based on some literary characters who can be quite mean, the short story, A Moment on the Lips, has got some hilarious parts, and I'm going to read two of them. I laughed out loud. They may not be so funny now, but I thought they were hilarious. Let me read one. It's on page 103 in your book. It says, I guess I should point out that most Cyclops aren't terribly bright. I don't mean to speak ill of my brethren, but it's true. And Loticlius is the dullest of us. It isn't that he can't put 2 and 2 together and come up with 4. He can't even put 2 and 2 together. I laughed out loud when I read that. I thought that was hilarious. Okay. Yeah. And now let me go. It's on page 105, same story. It says, dried brown blood splattered the walls like abstract cave art. I thought that was hilarious. I know you're laughing as you hear me laugh, but I just thought those things were too hilarious. You're reading the story and you just come across that. I just thought I had to bring it up when I knew I was going to interview you. So thank you. I just thought they were hilarious.
Well, good. Well, I'm so glad because that was my intention. I am a comedic writer. I mean, in a lot of ways, this book is a lot of, quite a few of the stories have humor, and I love writing funny. Writing funny is actually hard. It's hard to write funny work.
I'm sure it is. I'm sure it is. Yes. Yeah. Okay.
I mean, it's a challenge, particularly, because I'm not writing straight out fiction, but my favorite work all involves humor. I love funny books. Mm-hmm. I love another really important book for me is A Confederacy of Dunces, which is by John Kennedy Toole. It was published by LSU Press, who put out my first book, and it is just one of the funniest books I've ever encountered. But what I really love books that are incredibly humorous, but also incredibly have a deep emotional core. So I like stories that do both. I'm a really big fan of stories that do both. But I'm so glad to hear that you laughed at my Polyphemus story, because that was my intention. So I mean, those. I'm glad my jokes landed.
Yes. Now on the reverse side, Tigers Don't Apologize ends like the Twilight Zone. Are you familiar with that TV show?
Oh,
yes. Now
yes.
I don't want to reveal to the audience what happens, but what Jocelyn does to Mowgli, I thought, oh, this is so Twilight Zone. It really is. And you were very if that was your intent, you succeeded, because it really, I was frustrated with the ending because I didn't want it to end that way, but it was still brilliant writing because it was just so Twilight Zone.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Yeah, the Twilight Zone was a massively influential show. I watched it nonstop growing up. My parents, my dad especially, was a huge Twilight Zone fan. We watched it all the time. So yes, I am. That is, other people, you're not the first person to say that aspects of my work remind them of the show. And I have to say, yeah, absolutely.
Okay. All right. Okay. All right. Jen, at this point, what we'd like for you to do is to take a small section from your book and read it for the audience so they can get an idea of what your writing style is like.
Okay. No problem. And so I thought that I was actually thinking about reading what you read, the Polyphemus.
Oh, I hope I didn't ruin it.
No. Instead, I will read I'm just going to read it takes me about 2 minutes or a little over 2 minutes.
Okay, sure.
I'm just going to read I'm going to read the opening of the story that is called Never, Never.
Okay.
So, another story that has some humor. Okay. Never, Never. I was 14 when Mom married Captain Hook. My dad had vanished 6 years earlier, and I knew my mom was lonely, but I didn't think that gave her the right to wed the first one-handed swashbuckler who came down the pike. She'd started dating again when I was 12, working her way through a commodities broker, a puppeteer, and an elementary school principal. Until the day she came home from work raving about the man she'd met while power walking at the docks on her lunch hour, however, I didn't really think I had anything to worry about. Some creep was following me, and out of nowhere, this man swung in on a rope and landed between us. Mom acted out the scene in the middle of the kitchen. He grabbed the creep by the throat with his left hand, and he shook his right hand, which isn't a hand at all, but an iron hook, in the guy's face. He said if he didn't clear off, he'd eviscerate him. I'm sure Creepo had no idea what eviscerate means, but he ran for his life. Her rescuer sounded like a badass, but I couldn't admit that to my mom. It had been just the two of us since I was 8. And though I no longer allowed her to cuddle me or tousle my hair, I secretly missed the closeness we'd once shared. I knew it wasn't easy, raising me alone, keeping us afloat on what she made at the bank. But the thought of her getting serious about someone drove me up the wall. He asked if he could buy me a cup of coffee, and I let him. She poked around in the refrigerator, pulling out leftover spaghetti and dumping the congealed Tupperware-shaped blob into a Pam-coated frying pan. We sat on a bench, studying cargo ships, listening to seabirds. He told me things about the ocean, what kinds of creatures live in coral reefs, and how the moon's orbits control the tides. Oh, and what octopi do with their ink. How's he know so much about it? I glanced up from the pair of battling armored unicorns I sat sketching at the kitchen table. A kid who lived up the street had gotten me stoned after school, and when I'd started the drawing, I thought it would be really mind-blowing. But now that I wasn't so high anymore, I had my doubts. Is he some kind of sailor? He used to be. Mom piled spaghetti onto 2 plates and headed to the table with a green cylinder of Parmesan cheese. I plunged my fork into the mound of pasta and twirled. What about now? He just passed the civil service exam, she said. He starts at the post office next week.
I think your stories demonstrate that there's a fine line between comedy and tragedy, if I can use tragedy in a bad way. And you do a great job of blending the two without making fun of either one. And so that story is just ideal for that. So I'm so glad you picked it. Yes, yes.
You.
Okay.
That's a great way to characterize my work. I think of my work as tragic comic. That is a way that I've been thinking about my work. When you first start publishing stories and then people start asking you about your work and wanting to interview, you have to sort of start for the first time thinking, what am I doing with my writing? Mm-hmm. And that is a really wonderful and apt description because I love to walk a comedy tragedy line, because I think our entire lives we're walking a comedy tragedy line.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Okay. Yeah. All right, Jen, as we conclude, I want to give you an opportunity. If people who see this video want to contact you, what social media do you have? How can they reach you?
I am on Twitter. I do Twitter. I'm on Facebook and I'm on Instagram. And I have, I'm on, I think my Twitter handle is Fawkes on the Run. Like this, there's a song, it's a song.
Okay.
Fawkes, my last name, on the Run. Okay. I think that my Instagram handle is Lady J Fawkes. Okay. And then on Facebook, I'm just I'm Jen Fawkes on Facebook. Okay. I have an author page and then a personal page. Okay. And I also have a website. That's just www.jenfawkes.com. Okay. And there is a contact form there. If anyone wanted to reach out to me, you can send me an email via my website. Okay. And yeah, there's a whole bunch of my published work and interviews I've done and things like that are all collected there on my website. Okay. If anyone would like to check it out.
Okay. All right. Now, if someone wants to if they want to purchase your book, where can they go to purchase it, or how can they purchase it?
Yeah. really anywhere books are sold. Amazon, the Press 53 is the name of the press who put it out. They're in Winston-Salem. So on their website, which is I think it's just press53.com, or it might be .org. But then Amazon or Target, Walmart, like if there are all kinds of ways you could buy it online, and then also any bookstore can order it as well. Yeah.
So Barnes and Noble, bn.com. Okay.
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, this has been a pleasure. So thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Okay. So, audience, thank you for joining us today. It has been a pleasure. If you're interested in reading more from Jen Fawkes, please visit us at the library or find us online at Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, or our website, nlrlibrary.org. Join us again next time and have a great day, everyone. And thank you once again, Jen. It has been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you. It has also been my pleasure, Derek.
Okay. All right.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.